The date was April 1945, and the location was Camp Gruber, nestled in the heartland of Oklahoma. Captain Sarah Henderson of the Women's Army Corps stood in the crisp morning air outside a processing facility, watching as a transport truck lumbered toward her with an unusual cargo. Inside that truck were 43 German women who had been captured during the final chaotic weeks of the European War. These were not combat soldiers in the traditional sense. They were auxiliaries, clerks, radio operators, nurses, and administrators who had been swept up in the violent collapse of German military command structure as the Reich crumbled into dust and ashes. Most of these women were between the ages of 19 and 35, their lives interrupted by circumstances beyond their control. All of them looked absolutely terrified as they descended from the vehicle, uncertain about what fate awaited them in this foreign land called America. Captain Henderson had processed hundreds of male German prisoners of war throughout the preceding year, and she believed she had become accustomed to what such encounters would entail. She expected to see defiance in their eyes, perhaps a steely resignation to their circumstances, or the palpable fear of mistreatment that had been instilled in German soldiers and civilians by Nazi propaganda, describing the atrocities that American soldiers supposedly inflicted upon captives. What Henderson was profoundly unprepared for was the physical condition of these particular women standing before her. These women were not simply thin or undernourished, as she might have expected from soldiers captured at the end of a prolonged conflict. They were emaciated in a way that suggested systematic deprivation over an extended period. Their eyes were hollow and sunken deep into their skulls. Their uniforms hung from their bodies like drapes on a scarecrow, the fabric swallowing up the skeletal frames beneath. Their skin possessed a grayish, sallow appearance that spoke of months without adequate nutrition or sunlight. Their hair was dull and brittle, the lustrous quality of youth replaced by something fragile and damaged. Several of the women were limping noticeably as they walked, their feet clearly causing them pain with each step. Two of them required physical assistance from their companions, just to step down from the truck. But the most overwhelming sensory assault came from the smell emanating from this group of prisoners. Even from a distance of 20 feet, the odor was almost suffocating in its intensity. These women had not bathed or even washed themselves with water in weeks. Some of them likely had not experienced the basic human comfort of bathing in several months. The accumulated grime, sweat, and filth of prolonged deprivation hung around them like an invisible fog. As the women were lined up for the standard initial processing procedure that every prisoner underwent upon arrival at the camp, Captain Henderson noticed something in their expressions that she found profoundly difficult to interpret. She had expected to see fear in their faces, the kind of raw terror that she had observed countless times before in other German prisoners. But what she witnessed was something far more complex and emotionally laden than simple fear. The women were watching the American guards with an expression that mingled desperate hope with a disbelief that seemed to say they could not quite believe something they desperately wanted to believe, as if they were afraid to hope but were unable to prevent themselves from doing so anyway. The expressions on their faces suggested that they had prepared themselves for horrors, but were beginning to entertain the possibility that their expectations might be wrong. The standard processing procedure for prisoners of war at Camp Gruber was established and straightforward in its execution. Every prisoner would undergo a medical examination to assess their health status and identify any immediate medical concerns. They would receive a thorough washing, or what the military called a dousing, to remove accumulated dirt and filth from their bodies. They would then proceed to shower facilities where they could properly clean themselves with access to facilities and supplies. After the shower, they would be issued clean prison clothing to replace their filthy uniforms. Finally, they would be assigned to barracks where they would reside for the duration of their internment. Captain Henderson had personally supervised this entire routine hundreds of times over the past year. Processing prisoner after prisoner, through the same sequence of events, she understood the procedure so thoroughly that she could have executed it in her sleep. But as she looked at this particular group of prisoners, observing their physical condition and their emotional state, something deep in her instincts told her that this processing was not going to follow the usual pattern at all. Henderson called over to Sergeant Mary Kowalski, a woman who had the significant advantage of speaking fluent German and could serve as a translator between the prisoners and their American supervisors. "Tell them they'll be medically examined," Henderson instructed, her voice calm and professional. "Then they'll be taken to shower facilities, where they'll be given soap and clean clothing." she paused, making sure her instructions were clear and complete before continuing with the rest of the standard explanation. Kowalski, who had translated these same instructions for countless male prisoners, turned to the German women and began to relay the information in their native language, speaking clearly and distinctly so that every woman could understand what awaited her. The reaction from the German women was immediate, unexpected, and completely overwhelming in its intensity. Several of the women started crying, but these were not quiet, dignified tears shed in private. These were deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere primal within them, as if their very souls were being wrenched from their bodies. Other women simply stared at Sergeant Kowalski as if she had spoken something that was literally impossible, as if the words she had just said could not possibly mean what they seemed to mean. One woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s, a woman whose face suggested she had once been pretty before the hardships of war had etched themselves into her features, actually found her voice and spoke up in a tone of voice that trembled with overwhelming emotion. "Soap?" she asked, the words seeming almost too fragile to speak aloud. "Real soap? You will give us soap?" Sergeant Kowalski looked toward Captain Henderson, and her expression clearly conveyed her confusion at the intensity and apparent inexplicability of the reaction she was witnessing. What could possibly be so emotionally significant about being offered soap? Kowalski turned back to the German woman and confirmed what she had just said, speaking slowly and deliberately to make absolutely certain there could be no misunderstanding. "Yes, real soap for washing," she said. "You will be able to clean yourselves with real soap." What happened in that moment would remain seared into Captain Sarah Henderson's memory for the rest of her life, a scene she would replay in her mind thousands of times in the decades to come. The German woman who had asked about the soap suddenly collapsed to her knees as if her legs could no longer support her body weight. She began crying so intensely that she could barely breathe, her whole frame convulsed with sobs that seemed to contain all of the anguish and deprivation of the past years of war. Within seconds, this emotional breakdown became contagious among the group. More than half of the 43 women standing in that formation had begun breaking down completely. Some were crying with the same intensity as the first woman, others were simply standing in shocked silence, their minds apparently unable to process what they were hearing. Still others had begun holding on to each other for support, as if only the physical connection to another human being could keep them grounded in reality. Captain Henderson had no idea what she was witnessing, and her military training had not prepared her for managing a situation of this magnitude. Her first instinct was to assume that something medically serious was happening. She called immediately for Captain James Morrison, who served as the camp doctor, and who would presumably have some medical explanation for this collective emotional display. Henderson wondered if perhaps these women were experiencing some kind of shared mental breakdown triggered by the stress of capture and the trauma of being transported to a strange country. When Morrison arrived at the scene, he assessed the situation with a trained medical eye. But after a few moments of observation, he recognized that this was not a medical emergency in the conventional sense. Instead, he turned to Sergeant Kowalski and requested that she investigate and determine what was actually happening to these prisoners. Through the halting translation that Kowalski provided, interrupted repeatedly by tears and emotion, the extraordinary story began to emerge piece by piece. These German women had not seen real soap in more than 1 year. For the past 18 months, as Germany had progressively collapsed under the combined military pressure of the Allied forces from all directions, even the most basic hygiene supplies had entirely vanished from availability. By late 1944, what passed for soap in Germany was a gray-brown substance that bore almost no resemblance to genuine soap. This substance was manufactured from clay, ash, and various industrial chemicals that barely produced any lather when combined with water, and frequently caused skin irritation and painful reactions. By the beginning of 1945, even this inadequate substitute for soap had become completely unavailable, disappearing from stores and warehouses as the German government struggled to maintain any semblance of order. The women described to Kowalski the humiliation of washing themselves using only cold water when water was available at all. Sometimes they had resorted to scrubbing dirt from their skin using abrasive sand, a practice that left their skin raw and bleeding. They described the profound humiliation of being acutely aware of the smell of their own unwashed bodies and being entirely powerless to do anything about it. They described the shame that came from being unable to maintain basic personal cleanliness, from watching their hair become progressively more matted and tangled, from observing their skin break out in painful rashes and sores brought on by months without access to proper hygiene practices and supplies. One woman among the group, a former nurse named Greta who had worked in medical facilities before the capture, explained through her tears what the deprivation had meant. "We were told the Americans would torture us," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We were told that you would humiliate us, that you would treat us worse than you would treat animals, that there would be no mercy. And you are offering us soap, real soap. We have not seen such a thing in so long. We did not believe that such things still existed in the world. We thought everything was gone, everything was destroyed, everything had been taken from us." Captain Henderson listened to this explanation, and she made a decision that was not outlined in any military manual or standard operating procedure. This was a decision that emerged entirely from her own moral judgment and her understanding of what basic human dignity required. "Sergeant Kowalski," Henderson said, speaking with the authority that came from her rank and her position, "tell them the medical examination can wait for 1 hour. Take them immediately to the shower facilities now. Give them all the soap they want. Make sure the water is hot. Provide clean towels for each of them. Give them time to be clean again." The shower facility at Camp Gruber was a standard military installation, nothing that would be considered luxurious or even particularly comfortable by civilian standards. The facility featured a concrete floor that had been worn smooth by countless pairs of feet. Multiple shower heads were positioned throughout the space, each connected to institutional plumbing fixtures that were purely functional and completely devoid of any aesthetic consideration. However, the facility had one crucial advantage that made it seem like a palace to the German women who were about to enter it. The camp had access to abundant supplies of hot water, something that had been almost impossible to obtain in Germany for months, and the shelves in the facility were stocked full of bars of standard-issue military soap, the exact same soap that was provided to American soldiers. This soap was nothing special in any way. It was basic lye soap that smelled faintly of disinfectant, nothing more than functional hygiene supplies. But to the German women who walked into that shower room, the facility might as well have been transformed into the most luxurious spa resort ever constructed. Captain Henderson and Sergeant Kowalski had brought along female guards to supervise the shower process, as was required by standard military procedure for security purposes. These guards were there to ensure that nothing inappropriate occurred, and that the prisoners did not attempt any escape or harmful action. What these guards witnessed over the next 2 hours was not the routine prison shower that they expected to oversee. What unfolded before them was something that came far closer to resembling a religious experience or a spiritual awakening than a simple hygiene procedure. The women approached the bars of soap with an almost reverential attitude, picking up the bars carefully, as if the soap might somehow break if handled too roughly. Several of the women simply held the bars to their noses and breathed in the smell of cleanliness, the scent of the disinfectant somehow representing something pure and whole in a world that had become corrupted and broken. When the water was turned on and steam began to fill the shower room, creating a warm mist that rose toward the ceiling, multiple women began crying again. Not from sadness or distress this time, but from the overwhelming release of tension and trauma and deprivation. One woman who appeared to be in her 50s, her face lined with the hardships of age and war, walked to one of the shower head and allowed the hot water to pour down over her body while she was still completely clothed in her filthy uniform. She simply stood there, allowing the warmth and the sensation of water to wash over her fully clothed body, apparently not even caring about her clothes, just desperate to feel the sensation of warmth and moisture and cleanliness after months of deprivation. Eventually, this woman began to remove her clothing, and as she did, her body was revealed in its full condition, ravaged by malnutrition and marked by the accumulated effects of months without proper hygiene. Her skin was marked with sores and rashes. Her ribs were visible beneath her skin. Her legs were thin and fragile, bearing the marks of someone who had not received adequate nutrition in a very long time. The transformation that took place over the next nearly 2 hours was remarkable in its comprehensiveness. The women washed their hair multiple times using the bars of soap, washing with a kind of desperate thoroughness that spoke volume about how long it had been since they had last washed their hair properly. Some of them washed their hair 3 or 4 times, not because it was necessary, but because they could barely believe that they were allowed to use soap and hot water, and they wanted to experience the sensation as many times as possible before the privilege was somehow taken away. They scrubbed their skin with bars of soap until the skin turned pink from the friction. They washed their clothing in the showers, wringing it out and then washing it again, unable to accept that their clothes could be getting cleaner because they had gone so long without the ability to wash anything properly. Some women simply stood under the hot water with their eyes closed, crying quietly, allowing months or even years of accumulated shame and deprivation and hopelessness to wash away down the drain, along with the dirt and grime from their bodies. Sergeant Kowalski, watching this scene unfold before her, felt tears beginning to form in her own eyes as she witnessed the profound significance of what was happening. She turned to Captain Henderson, and her voice was thick with emotion. "Captain," she said, "I don't think we understood what it was like over there at the end. These women, they're not enemy combatants in the way we usually think about them. They're victims of the same regime that we were fighting. They're suffering from the same government that we fought against." The medical examinations that took place after the women had finished their showers revealed the full and complete extent of what these women had endured during the final years of the war. The doctors and medical staff found evidence of chronic malnutrition that had affected not just their weight, but their entire physiological systems. They discovered multiple vitamin deficiencies that had caused conditions like scurvy, conditions that had not been widely seen in developed countries for generations. They documented numerous skin infections that had resulted from prolonged lack of hygiene and lack of access to medical treatment. They found significant dental problems that resulted from the inadequate diet that the German population had been forced to subsist on. They observed respiratory issues that indicated prolonged exposure to poor living conditions and inadequate shelter. One woman had been walking on a broken foot that had never been properly set or treated because medical care had been entirely unavailable in the chaos of Germany's collapse. This woman had been walking on a broken foot for weeks, enduring the pain without any possibility of treatment. Dr. Morrison, after completing his examination of all 43 women and reviewing the findings of his medical team, sat down that night and wrote a comprehensive medical report that would be filed in the official record of the camp. In that report, Morrison wrote, "The physical condition of these prisoners suggests prolonged severe deprivation that extends well beyond what would be expected from recent combat operations. The evidence collected during physical examination indicates a systematic breakdown of civilian infrastructure and a collapse of basic public health measures that appears to have been occurring over a period of months. I strongly recommend full nutritional rehabilitation and extended medical care for all of these prisoners to address the long-term effects of this deprivation." Over the following days and weeks, as the German women slowly recovered physically and began to develop trust in their American captors, more detailed stories emerged from conversations between the prisoners and their supervisors. The women described the final months in Germany in terms that suggested the country had regressed into conditions more reminiscent of medieval times than a modern nation-state. Food supplies had completely collapsed, with the general population struggling to obtain enough calories to survive. Water systems had failed in many areas, leaving people without access to clean drinking water. Electricity, which had once been relatively reliable, had become sporadic at best, often unavailable for days or weeks at a time. Medical supplies of any kind had become virtually non-existent, leaving sick or injured people with no possibility of treatment. The soap shortage was merely one symptom of a much more profound and systematic breakdown of all infrastructure that a modern society depends upon. The women had been living on the edge of survival for months. Many of these women had completely believed the Nazi propaganda that had been drilled into them repeatedly about what would happen if they were captured by American forces. They had been told that the Americans would treat them brutally, that surrender meant torture, that they would be beaten and humiliated and worse. The cognitive dissonance that they experienced upon arriving at Camp Gruber was profound and disorienting. They had prepared themselves psychologically for the worst possible treatment, steeling themselves to endure cruelty and humiliation. And instead they found themselves being treated better than they had been treated by their own government during the final years of the war. They were offered food, they were provided with medical care, they were given clean clothing, they were allowed to wash themselves with soap and hot water, they were treated with a basic level of human dignity and respect that they had not experienced in years. Several days after the initial shower incident, after Gredia, the former nurse had recovered enough physically and emotionally to process what had happened to her and what it meant. She spoke with Sergeant Kowalski in a quiet conversation that would be remembered by those who witnessed it. "I spent the entire war believing that we were fighting for civilization against barbarism," Gredia said quietly, her voice thoughtful and reflective. "I was told that Nazi Germany represented the height of civilization and culture, and that our enemies represented primitive barbarism that needed to be destroyed. And then at the end we had no soap, no food, no medicine, nothing. We were living worse than barbarians, in conditions of degradation and deprivation that were almost unimaginable. We were living in circumstances that were far worse than anything we had been told about life in the countries we considered our enemies. And then the people we were told were barbaric and cruel. The Americans that we feared, they gave us hot water and soap and treated our injuries with care and respect. I don't know what to believe anymore about anything I was told. Everything has been turned on its head. The experiences that occurred at Camp Gruber were not unique or isolated incidents. Similar scenes were repeated at other prisoner of war facilities, spread across the United States, as more German prisoners arrived in the final months and weeks of the war. The pattern was remarkably consistent across these different locations. Prisoners were arriving in shocking physical condition that suggested systematic and prolonged deprivation. Military officers and medical staff at these facilities observed the same pattern of breakdown in basic hygiene and medical care that had occurred in Germany. And in every location, American personnel witnessed the profound psychological impact that resulted when prisoners who had been living under Nazi rule were suddenly treated humanely by American captors, with basic dignity and access to supplies and comfort that they had been denied for years. The incident involving the soap and the tears would become known among the camp staff and in the informal histories of Camp Gruber as the soap incident, and military intelligence officers found the implications of this incident to be quite valuable for their understanding of Germany's situation. The physical and psychological condition of these prisoners provided concrete evidence of just how completely and thoroughly German infrastructure had collapsed. The fact that something as basic and fundamental as soap was unavailable was not merely an inconvenience. It was a clear indication of a total breakdown of civilian infrastructure that went far beyond military defeat on the battlefield. It suggested a civilian population that had been completely abandoned by its own government, left to fend for themselves without access to even the most basic supplies necessary for survival and dignity. For the American personnel who were stationed at Camp Gruber, the soap incident and the broader experience of receiving and processing these German women prisoners was transformative in its impact on their thinking about the enemy and about the war. Many of these American soldiers and officers had entered military service filled with the propaganda and received wisdom about German efficiency, discipline, and ruthlessness that had been circulated throughout American society. The images of the German war machine had been portrayed as almost superhuman in its effectiveness and its terrible power. But what these American personnel witnessed when they encountered the actual German women prisoners contradicted these stereotypes and humanized the enemy in a way that no amount of training or briefing could possibly have accomplished. These German women were not the ruthless enemy that propaganda had portrayed. They were victims who were suffering from the same totalitarian regime that the Americans had been fighting against. Captain Henderson, moved by what she had witnessed and what she had learned about the conditions in Germany, made the decision to request authorization to provide additional amenities and comforts to the female prisoners beyond what standard military procedures required. She requested and received approval to provide better and more nutritious food than the basic prisoner rations. She obtained access to reading materials and books that the women could read during their free time. She arranged for the women to have access to recreational activities and opportunities for physical activity. Most importantly, she ensured that the women received medical care that went far beyond simply treating immediate acute medical conditions. The medical care that Henderson authorized addressed the long-term health issues that had been caused by the prolonged deprivation that these women had experienced. Her reasoning for this decision was stated in an official memo that was filed in the camp records and would eventually make its way up the chain of command through the military bureaucracy. Henderson's reasoning was blunt and direct and left no room for misinterpretation. "These women are not criminals," she wrote. "They are victims of the same regime that we fought and defeated. Treating them humanely is not merely a matter of legal obligation under the Geneva Conventions. It serves our fundamental values as a nation and demonstrates the critical difference between democratic societies and totalitarian ones. How we treat these prisoners reflects the kind of nation we are and what we stand for." Henderson's memo, which had originated from a relatively low-ranking officer overseeing a prisoner of war camp in Oklahoma, made its way up through the military chain of command and eventually contributed to policy changes regarding the treatment of German civilian prisoners throughout American prison camps. While the Geneva Conventions legally required humane treatment of prisoners of war, Henderson's approach went significantly beyond mere legal compliance with international law. Her approach represented active rehabilitation and the restoration of human dignity to people who had been denied it for far too long. Her example of compassion and humanity influenced how other commanders approached the care and management of German prisoners in their facilities. In the months following the end of the war in Europe and the eventual conclusion of the entire war with Japan, the German women prisoners who had been held at Camp Gruber began the process of repatriation to occupied Germany, returning to their homeland to begin the difficult process of rebuilding their lives and their nation. However, many of these women maintained correspondence with the American personnel who had supervised their internment at the camp. These letters, written in careful English or halting German, as the women struggled to express themselves in a foreign language, revealed a consistent and recurring theme in their thoughts and feelings. The shower incident and the provision of basic dignity and hygiene supplies had been a turning point in their understanding of the war and its meaning, a moment when everything they had been told and everything they had believed had been called into question and fundamentally reversed. One letter in particular, written by Greta to Sergeant Kowalski several months after the end of the war, captured the profound significance of what had occurred at Camp Gruber with remarkable eloquence. The letter was written in halting English, every word a testament to Greta's determination to express herself despite the language barrier. "You gave us soap when we expected torture," Greta wrote. "You gave us dignity when we expected humiliation. You showed us what humanity looks like when it is not twisted by propaganda and hate." I will never forget the moment I stood in that shower room, holding real soap in my hands and understanding for the first time that everything I had been told was a lie. Everything I had been taught to believe about America and Americans was wrong. Thank you for treating us like human beings when we did not expect to be treated as such. Thank you for showing us that civilization still existed in the world. The soap incident gradually became part of the oral history that was preserved among the personnel who had served at Camp Gruber. The stories that were told and retold among former guards and administrators as they encountered each other in the years following the war. However, the incident was not widely or extensively documented in the official military records of the camp. It was considered too small in scale, too personal and focused on individual human interactions, too focused on basic human needs and dignities to fit into the grand narrative of military operations and strategic victory that official military histories typically emphasized. And yet, for the people who were actually present at the camp, both the American guards and supervisors and the German women prisoners, the incident represented something genuinely profound about the difference between societies that are able to maintain their humanity even when dealing with enemies, and those that have abandoned humanity entirely, even in their treatment of their own people. Sarah Henderson eventually retired from active military service in 1946, just a year after the war in Europe ended. She made the transition to civilian life and spent the next 30 years working as a social worker in Oklahoma, helping people navigate poverty and hardship and personal crisis. During those 30 years, she helped thousands of individuals and families, but she remained relatively quiet about her military experiences. When people asked her, late in her life, about her most significant and meaningful wartime experience, she never spoke about processing thousands of prisoners or about managing the complex operations of a large military facility. Instead, she talked about one specific moment, one specific incident that had stayed with her through all the decades that had passed since April 1945. She talked about the day when 43 German women began crying because someone had offered them soap. "We won the war with tanks and planes and ships," Henderson would say when recounting the memory. "Those were the weapons and machines that defeated Germany on the battlefield and ensured our military victory. But we won the peace, we secured the future, by remembering that even enemies are human beings who deserve basic dignity. Those women taught me something that I never forgot. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world is simply treating people decently when they expect only cruelty and mistreatment. A bar of soap and some hot water did more to defeat Nazi ideology in those women's minds than any amount of propaganda or re-education or lectures could ever have accomplished. It accomplished more than military might could accomplish. It changed how they saw the world and what they believed about their enemy. The story of the German women who cried over soap is a small footnote in the vast and complicated history of World War II, a minor incident in the grand narrative of the war that changed the world. It did not change the course of military operations. It did not affect the outcome of battles or the strategy of commanders. It has no place in the official histories of the war that focus on grand strategic movements and large-scale operations. But this story reveals a truth that transcends military history and speaks to something universal about human nature and human values. The story demonstrates that the true measure of a society's values and its civilization is not how it treats its heroes or its honored citizens or the people who are powerful and successful. The true measure of a society's values is how it treats those who have no power and no claim to kindness, those who are vulnerable and dependent on the mercy and compassion of others. The true measure is what happens in the quiet moments when power is absolute, when no one is watching except a few witnesses, when basic human decency can either be offered or withheld with no consequence to the person making that choice. Sometimes the most profound moments of a war, the moments that truly matter and that people remember for the rest of their lives, are not the battles where thousands died, or the strategic victories that changed the course of history. Sometimes the most profound moments are the quiet instances, when basic human decency breaks through years of propaganda and hatred and fear, and reminds everyone involved that underneath uniforms and ideologies, underneath the identities that nations construct for their enemies, people are just people. They are people who need soap and hot water. They are people who need to feel clean. They are people who deserve the dignity of basic hygiene and basic respect. And when that dignity is offered to them, sometimes they cry, and their tears become a testament to the power of simple human kindness in a world that had shown them only cruelty.